There are men who live, and there are men who echo. Julius Caesar was not merely a ruler. He was a storm in human form. His footsteps shook the republic, his voice bent the will of nations, and his death carved the birth of an empire. In every shadow cast by Rome's marble pillars, his name still lingers. Because some legacies are not written in ink. They are written in blood, ambition, and eternity. The wind whispers through the ruins of Rome. Through the broken arches, the shattered marble, the hollow halls once filled with the sound of senators, soldiers, and the pulse of a civilization that conquered the known world. And if you listen closely, beneath the silence, you can still hear it, the echo of a name that refused to die. Julius Caesar. He was not born into power. He seized it with words sharper than swords and dreams too vast for the republic to contain. Rome was crumbling from within, eaten by greed, divided by pride, drowning in its own politics. The Senate argued while its borders burned. Its people starved while its nobles feasted. The republic had lost its soul, and from that dying light rose a man who refused to watch it fade. Caesar was not a hero in the way history paints them. He was something greater and far more dangerous. A man who believed destiny could be bent by his will. He walked through chaos with the calm of a storm, understanding something no other Roman dared to grasp. That power was not given, it was taken. In his youth, he was hunted, exiled, nearly killed. Yet every trial only carved the marble of his resolve. When pirates captured him, he laughed in their faces, promising that when he was free, he'd return to crucify them. They thought him mad, but when he was released, he made good on his promise. As was Caesar, he didn't make threats. He wrote history with them. As he climbed through Rome's treacherous hierarchy, he learned that loyalty was a blade with two edges. Friends smiled as they plotted. Allies praised as they waited for his fall. Caesar played the game differently. He didn't seek friends. He sought believers. Men who would march into the impossible for him. And they did, for they saw in him something Rome had forgotten. Vision. When he spoke, the people listened. Not because he demanded it, but because he believed every word he spoke. He promised them not peace, but purpose, not comfort, but greatness. And in return, they gave him everything a man could ever want: trust, love, and fear. But destiny is a heavy crown. Caesar's rise was not the tale of fortune, but of fire. He walked the line between ambition and damnation, and he never looked down. His enemies called him arrogant. But to Caesar, arrogance was simply the name the weak gave to those who dared too much. He saw Rome as marble waiting to be reshaped, a sleeping god that needed to be awakened. And so, he set forth to rewrite what Rome meant. Every step he took brought him closer to the divine, and further from the man he once was. He began to see the republic not as a home, but as an obstacle, a broken system that needed to be reborn, even if it meant blood would have to wash the streets clean. And when he gazed upon the city he loved, the city he would one day rule, he whispered not a prayer, but a vow. Rome shall not fade while I still draw breath. Those words became his weapon, his compass, his curse. For in seeking to save Rome, Caesar began to create something far greater and far more terrifying than even he could control. The republic had birthed its own shadow, a man whose hunger would outlast his heart. A leader who would lift Rome to the heavens before it learned what it meant to fall. The year was 58 BC. The Republic had sent Caesar to the distant, untamed lands of Gaul, a wild expanse of forest and blood, where tribes roamed like ghosts and Rome's banners were but whispers in the wind. They thought this assignment would bury him, that the wilderness would consume him, that the Senate could finally breathe without the shadow of Caesar looming over their marble floors. But they had forgotten who they were dealing with. Caesar did not go to Gaul to disappear. He went to become immortal. The legions that marched beside him were not mere soldiers. They were believers, bound by loyalty and the promise of glory. Through mud, blood, and winter's breath, they carved their way across the continent, led by a man who saw not just enemies, but opportunity. To his men, Caesar was not a commander. He was a force of nature. He shared their hunger, their cold, their exhaustion. He called them by name. He slept among them beneath the same stars. When they bled, he bled beside them. And in that bond, deeper than politics, purer than fear, he forged the most unstoppable army the ancient world had ever seen. The Bene Vidi Vici, he would later write, I came, I saw, that was true. The battles of Gaul were not won by numbers, but by will. Surrounded by enemies tenfold, Caesar stood at the heart of chaos and saw only patterns, movements in the storm. He turned defeat into strategy, retreat into ambush, and death into legend. Villages burned, rivers ran red, and the name Caesar became a whisper of dread carried on the northern wind. Each victory carved his name deeper into history, not with ink, but with the bones of those who dared to stand against him. Yet behind every triumph, Rome trembled. The Senate watched with unease as reports of Caesar's victories arrived like thunderclaps. With every conquest, his legend grew, and with it, his power. For each city he conquered abroad, he conquered 1,000 hearts back home. The people loved him not for what he destroyed, but for what he represented: strength, justice, destiny. In a world of cowards hiding behind speeches, Caesar was action incarnate. And yet, the higher he rose, the deeper his shadow grew. The war in Gaul changed him. It hardened him, stripped away the last remnants of the idealistic youth who once sought to restore the Republic. He began to see what others could not, that the Republic's time had passed, that only through one man's vision could Rome survive the weight of its own decay. But power once tasted is never sated. The conquest of Gaul was not the end of Caesar's journey. It was the awakening of something larger, something ancient. Rome had not merely expanded its borders, it had awakened a god in mortal flesh. And as Caesar stood upon the cliffs of the northern frontier, staring over lands newly conquered, he felt the pull of destiny like a blade against his throat. Behind him, the Senate plodded. Ahead of him, the world awaited. He had crossed mountains, rivers, and death itself. But the greatest crossing still lay before him, for beyond the Rubicon, beyond that thin silver line of water, waited not victory, but fate. Gaul had forged the legend. Rome would face the consequence. It was the winter of 49 BC. The river lay still, a thin silver vein beneath a gray Roman sky. On one side stood Gaul, the land of his triumphs. On the other, Italy, his home, his destiny, and the heart of a republic trembling in fear of his return. The Senate had ordered him to disband his legions, to return as a private man stripped of command, stripped of dignity, stripped of everything that made him Caesar. But there are moments in history when a man's choice does not belong to him alone, when his decision tilts the balance of centuries. Julius Caesar stood before the Rubicon, knowing that one step forward would mean civil war, that the very Rome he claimed to love would burn. And yet, he also knew something else, that to turn back was to betray not only himself, but the destiny that had followed him since his first breath. His men watched in silence, the air heavy with the weight of eternity. For years they had marched through blood and frost beside him, but never had they seen him hesitate. He stared into the water and saw not a river, but the reflection of everything he had become. The Republic had sent him to the edges of the world, and he had returned as something more than a man. The Senate had tried to control him with laws and fear, but he had mastered both. They had made him powerful, and now they would reap what they had sown. Aliai acta etiest, he whispered at last. The die is cast. His horse stepped forward, the river breaking around its hooves like time itself giving way. Behind him the legions followed, one by one, as the sky thundered with the sound of destiny waking from its sleep. That moment, the crossing of the Rubicon was not just a march toward Rome, it was a march toward immortality. For Caesar knew what awaited him: betrayal, blood, and the collapse of everything he once swore to protect. But he crossed nonetheless, because men like Caesar do not live for peace, they live for purpose. As he advanced, the streets of Italy filled with whispers. Some called him a savior, others a tyrant. But whether loved or feared, he was inevitable. The Senate scrambled, Pompey fled, and the Republic, that proud ancient system, began to fracture beneath the weight of a single man's will. Caesar marched not as a conqueror this time, but as a man coming home to claim what had always been his, Rome itself. And in his march he revealed the truth the Senate had long denied, that the Republic had already fallen long before his legions crossed that river. It had died in corruption, in greed, in the whispers of cowards who mistook rhetoric for leadership. Caesar did not kill the Republic. He merely gave it a name, empire. When he entered the city, no trumpet sounded, no grand coronation declared. Only silence. The kind of silence that comes when the world realizes it has changed forever. In that silence, the shadow of one man stretched across the Tiber and touched every corner of Rome. Senators trembled in their marble halls, poets wrote in awe, and common men knelt in the streets, for Rome had seen countless generals before him, but never one who dared to cross the line between duty and destiny. Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, and from that moment on, the world would never again belong to the Republic. It would belong to him. The city of Rome glistened beneath the dawn, not with light, but with power. Caesar had returned victorious. Pompey was gone. The Civil War had ended in his triumph. The world that had once defied him now knelt before him in awe. The people called him Father of the Nation. The Senate, once his enemy, crowned him dictator for life. And for the first time in centuries, Rome knew peace. But peace, in the hands of powerful men, is rarely innocent. The Republic had become a theater, and Caesar, its reluctant god. He walked through the marble halls of the Senate as if among ghosts. Men who smiled too widely, bowed too deeply, whispered too quietly. They praised him in the daylight and plotted in the dark. To the people he was salvation. To the senators he was a storm that refused to pass. They watched as the people adored him, as his name filled the streets, as his statues rose higher than their gods. And fear began to spread faster than loyalty. For they saw in him not just power, but permanence. What if he wanted a crown? 3 times they offered it. 3 times he refused. But the truth, the painful, unspoken truth, was that he no longer needed it. The crown had already found its place, not upon his head, but within his heart. Yet even as he refused the title of king and began to see him as one, the people chanted his name not as a leader, but as destiny. His image replaced the Republic's symbols. His word became law. And in that quiet moment between admiration and fear, the dagger of betrayal was forged. Among those who conspired were men he had once called brothers, Brutus, Cassius, senators who owed their lives, their wealth, and their honor to him. They whispered of liberty while clutching the chains of their own envy. They claimed to save Rome, yet it was jealousy that guided their hands. But Caesar trusted them, perhaps too much. On the morning of the Ides of March, the air was strangely calm. A soothsayer had warned him. Beware of the Ides of March, he smiled, brushing it aside as superstition. For how could a man who had conquered worlds fear the shadows of men hiding behind words? He entered the Senate chamber, his robes trailing across the marble floor. The same marble that would soon be stained red. The blades came swiftly, whispers turning to screams, loyalty to blood. That too, Brute. Not words of anger, but of heartbreak. In that moment, the great Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, breaker of the Republic, the man who commanded legions and bent empires, fell not to armies, but to the hands of those he once trusted. Rome stood still. The Senate floor, drenched in crimson, reflected the face of a dying dream. And as Caesar fell, so too did the last breath of the Republic he tried to save. The men who claimed to protect it had destroyed it instead. Outside, the people wept. Inside, the conspirators trembled. For though Caesar's body lay still, his shadow began to rise, larger, darker, eternal. They had killed the man, but unleashed the myth, and from the blood upon that marble floor, Rome's destiny shifted once more. For in trying to end his reign, they had ensured it would never truly die. Caesar had refused the crown of gold, but in death he was crowned with eternity. The ideas had passed, the daggers had done their work, and yet Rome did not awaken to freedom. It awoke to silence. The conspirators stood over Caesar's body, expecting cheers, expecting gratitude, expecting the Republic to rise again like a phoenix. But the gods were watching and they were silent. Outside the Senate walls, the city trembled. The people, the same people who once cheered Caesar's triumphs through the streets, now looked upon his murderers not as saviors, but as traitors, because they had not slain a tyrant. They had slain a vision. The marble floors of the Curia still glistened with his blood when the whispers began. He was not perfect, they said, but he was ours. His name rolled across Rome like thunder, carried by the lips of those who once had nothing. The soldiers he led, the poor he fed, the citizens he gave hope to. The men who struck him down had underestimated the one thing Caesar understood better than any man alive. You can kill a man, but you cannot kill his idea. And so, as his body was carried through the streets, Rome wept. Mark Antony stepped before the people, the air thick with grief, and spoke the words that would turn sorrow into fire. He lifted his hand toward the heavens, his voice trembling with vengeance. And as Caesar's blood-stained cloak unfurled before the crowd, a storm was born. The city that once feared his power now burned for his justice. The mob rose like a wave, and the streets that had echoed with betrayal now cried out his name once more. Caesar! 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 Rome descended into chaos, not because Caesar ruled it, but because he no longer did. Out of that chaos came Octavian, Caesar's heir, his blood, his legacy, a boy molded in the shadow of a fallen god. Under his hand, the Republic drew its final breath, and the Empire, the great machine that would dominate the world for centuries, was born. Augustus wore the crown, but Caesar's shadow ruled the throne. His image adorned the coins, his name became divine, his spirit immortal. The Senate that had feared him now worshipped him as a god. The Republic that killed him now built temples in his honor. And in that cruel twist of destiny, the man they sought to erase became the very foundation of the world they created. His shadow stretched far beyond Rome, across continents, across time. It haunted emperors, inspired generals, and echoed through every ruler who ever dared to believe that destiny could be shaped by will alone. From Napoleon to Alexander's dreamers, from kings to conquerors, all stood beneath the long, dark shadow of Julius Caesar. Because Caesar was never just a man, he was a mirror, reflecting humanity's greatest strength and its greatest sin, the hunger for greatness. In the end, Rome became everything he envisioned, powerful, eternal, defied. But it came at a cost. The Republic's freedom was buried beside him, and the marble city became both his monument and his tomb. And so the question remains, or its destroyer? Perhaps he was both. For history does not remember men by what they intended, but by the shadows they leave behind. And in that shadow, vast, unending, and eternal, Julius Caesar still walks, the rise, the fall, and the echo of a man who refused to be forgotten.